Dorothy Arnold was born on July 1st, 1885 in New York City. She was the second child to parents Frances Rose Arnold and Mary Martha Parks Arnold. The Arnold family were known as wealthy for being in the business of good imports like perfume. Dorothy would go to Bryn Mawr College to study literature and language, and she would also be in the graduating class of 1905. After graduating college, she would move back to New York City to pursue a career in writing. Dorothy would try to apply to magazine companies to get her work out into the world. However, she would face rejection. Her rejections caused her friends and family to tease her about not being able to get a job as a writer. Because of this, Dorothy would open a private mailbox for her application results to avoid being teased if she failed again. Unfortunately, Dorothy would never be accepted as a writer for a profession. However, with this lack of success, Dorothy was viewed from the outside as a happy person. At 11 in the morning of December 12, 1910, Dorothy would make her way down the stairs of her family home to go tell her mother, Martha, that today she was going to go shopping to find a dress for her sister's party, which her name was Marjorie, which was scheduled on the 17th of that month. Martha was sick at that time, but she was willing to go with Dorothy. She told Dorothy that she wanted to come, but for some reason Dorothy said, "No, Mother, don't bother. You don't feel just right, and it's no use going to the trouble. I mightn't see the thing I want, but if I do, I'll phone you." When Dorothy left, she was carrying $25 of her $100 allowance. However, the day before, she withdrew $36 from the bank to be able to afford lunch for her friends at a restaurant called Sherry's. And she might have been carrying her nightgown, but she might have been hiding it in her muffs. After Dorothy left, she went to a candy store called Parks and Tilford's to purchase a half-pound of chocolates. Right after, Dorothy would make her way down the icy streets of New York City to 27th Street. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dorothy was standing outside talking to a friend named Gladys Kane outside Brentano's bookshop, which is located at 5th Avenue and 27th Street. However, after talking to her friend, she made her way to Central Park, and this would be the last time she would be seen. Gladys would say after talking to Dorothy, she seemed in a good and happy mood, and there seemed that there wasn't anything wrong with her. Dorothy was last seen wearing a well-tailored suit, a blue coat, a skirt, a black hat with roses for decoration, and a handbag. That night, when she didn't make it back for dinner without giving her family any warning, they got worried. They would make phone calls to Dorothy's close friends, but they hadn't seen her. However, one of Dorothy's friends, Elise Henry, who was called by the family, would call back after midnight. She would ask if Dorothy returned, and Miss Arnold would say yes, she's here. Elise would ask to speak to Dorothy, but Miss Arnold would say that she had a headache and went to bed. However, in reality, Dorothy wasn't there at all. It is still unknown why Miss Arnold lied about Dorothy making it back home. The next morning, when Dorothy still hadn't come home, Mr. Arnold called their lawyer and family friend John S. Keith. John would search Dorothy's room and found nothing out of the ordinary except there were some burnt papers in the fireplace. Dorothy didn't take anything that would help her run away or anything valuable from her room. When she went missing, Dorothy had a boyfriend who was 42-year-old George Grimson Jr., who was an engineer. They met at Bryn Mawr when Dorothy was attending. Dorothy's parents didn't support the relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Arnold didn't want George as a son-in-law because of the 17-year age gap, and also George seemed kinda lazy. A year before Dorothy went missing, she would lie to her parents by saying that she was going to see an old college friend. However, in reality, she went all the way to Boston to see George, and after Mr. and Mrs. Arnold realized what she was really doing, they forbade her from seeing George. The Arnolds suspected that George was in on Dorothy being missing. However, their theory was quickly disproved when they found out that George was in Italy when she went missing. On December 16th, 1910, the Arnolds sent a telegraph to George in Italy asking if he knew where Dorothy was, but he said that he had no idea where Dorothy was. However, George's answer didn't make them believe that he was innocent, so Miss Arnold and Dorothy's brother John flew out to Florence, Italy to go to the hotel that George was staying at. However, when they talked to George in person, he said that he loved Dorothy, but he didn't know where she went. Apparently, John wasn't having it that day because John KO'd George right in the jaw. Meanwhile, John Keith was back in New York City trying to figure out the case. Keith would search hospitals, morgues, and even ship ports for Dorothy, but nothing came up. Keith needed more help, so I called George S. Doughty, who was the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who would start a private investigation. Still at this time, Mr. Arnold didn't call the police about his missing daughter because Mr. Arnold didn't want to make it known to the public for some reason. The investigation continued for 6 weeks, and finally, in mid-January of 1911, police were called, but even with the police helping, they still couldn't find anything. Police would suggest that the Arnolds have a press conference about Dorothy. So on January 25th, 1911, a press conference would be held at Mr. Arnold's office, and the Arnolds would hold a $1,000 reward reward if they found her, which would be over $32,000 in today's money. Dorothy's disappearance was all over the US and newspapers. There are thousands of tips or reports of sightings of Dorothy, which were all fake. During this time when the case was all over America, the Arnold family received 2 ransom notes, demanding $5,000 to get Dorothy back, and also threatening Marjorie, Dorothy's sister. However, to this day, this case is still unsolved. On April 10, 1928, 2 newlyweds, Glenn and Bessie Hyde, were going to their honeymoon that would be at the Grand Canyon. The two had met on a boat to Los Angeles in 1927. The two had an instant connection. When the two met, Bessie was married. However, the day before Glenn and Bessie got married, her divorce was finalized. The reason they chose the Grand Canyon was because Glenn wanted to set the record for the fastest time to go through the canyon, and if they completed the journey, it would make Bessie a celebrity because she'd be the first woman to complete the trail. On October 20th of that year, the two would start the first part of their journey on Glenn's scow that he made. A scow is basically a boat. They would start from Green River, Utah, with the goal of arriving at Needles, California by early December. After 26 days, the couple would make it to Bright Angel Trail, where they would go to visit photographer Emery Kolb. Emery would notice that the couple wasn't carrying life jackets on the boat, and he also said that their boat wasn't safe for the winter, and they should stay with him until the winter is over. Emery offered them life jackets, but Glenn would not only decline the life jackets, but he would also decline staying with Emery for the winter. Emery also noticed that Bessie seemed done with the trip and didn't want to go back out onto the water. On November 18th, still ignoring Emery's advice, the couple would go back onto the water. However, one of Emery's friends, Adolph G. Sutra, would travel with the couple for several miles until they reached Hermit Rapid, which is when Adolph would leave the couple. Adolph would be the last person to see the couple alive. On December 6th, Glenn's father was waiting for his son to return home from his almost 2-month-long journey. However, both Glenn and Bessie were nowhere to be seen. Because of this, Glenn's father would report them missing, and 2 Army observation planes were sent out from Marchfield to Riverside, California to go look for the couple. On December 19th, the couple's boat was located on mile 237. The boat was sat upright, with supplies being strapped in place. Both Bessie and Glenn weren't on the boat. There also weren't any footprints on the boat either. Unfortunately, this case remained unsolved until 1971. On a commercial Grand Canyon trip, an older woman was one of the passengers. While she and the other passengers and guides were sitting around the campfire talking about the Hydes going missing, she said that she was Bessie Hyde. She continued talking, and the other passengers had mixed emotions. She said what really had happened was Glenn was abusive, and she had finally stabbed him, which could have been the real reason why she didn't want to go back out on the boat. She said after she stabbed him, she would flee the boat and would escape the canyon entirely. However, the woman's claims of Glenn being abusive is not a certain fact. Eventually, the woman's claim would change once officials found her. She basically played dumb and said she had no idea what they were talking about. In 1992, famous director Georgie Clark, who had passed away that year, was thought to be Bessie Hyde. There are some documents that she had, which included a copy of Bessie and Glenn's marriage certificate. However, there weren't any evidence that she was in fact Bessie Hyde. Another big break would come in the case when in 1976, the skeletal remains of a young male would be found in the canyon. Theorists would jump to the conclusion that it was Glenn Hyde's remains. It also turns out that a bullet was found in the skull of the remains, which led to people thinking that both of them had been shot, and Emery Kolb had something to do with the murder. Even further proving this theory, it turns out there were skeletal remains on his property. However, this was disproved when the body turned out to be no older than 22 years old, while Glenn was 29 when he went missing. Also, the person who died would have died around or after 1972. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Etta Ryle was born on May 4, 1914 in Providence, Rhode Island, to parents Joseph Ryle and Rose Ryle. Etta went to Oxford High School in Oxford, Massachusetts. While she was there, she met her boyfriend, Henry Solon. However, after they graduated, Etta would find out she was pregnant. Etta said that the baby's father belonged to Henry, and she would file a paternity suit against him. Etta was going to Worcester State Teachers College at the time, and Henry was going to Bates College in Maine, so the two weren't even in the same state. However, the two kept in contact. In September of 1934, Etta's daughter Alma was born. Fast forward to 2 months after Alma was born on November 21st, 1934. Etta was thinking about the paternity suit that was happening the next day. She seemed anxious and depressed about it until an evening that she spent with Henry on a drive in his car. After she got back from the drive, she seemed really happy because she said that she and Henry were getting married. She also told her sister that she was going up to New York City that night. Etta packed a small bag and wasn't bringing Alma along. However, she did say she would come back within the week for Alma. Sometime after midnight, a police officer saw Henry's car parked outside of Etta and her family's home. Etta would come out of her home and leave with Henry in his car. This would be the last time anyone would see Etta Ryle. Later that day on the 22nd, Etta's paternity suit was scheduled for that day. However, Etta was nowhere to be seen. That day, Etta's sister would run into Henry and she would ask him why he and Etta decided to get married and about the trip to New York City all of a sudden. Henry would say that he knew nothing about them getting married, and also he said he knew nothing about the New York City trip. Henry would say that he dropped off Etta at Worcester's Union Station in Worcester, Massachusetts. Henry didn't know where she went. Etta was reported missing and police would go to Henry since he was the last person to see her. Henry would tell police that Etta falsely accused him of being the father of her child. Henry would also mention to police how Etta seemed apprehensive about the paternity suit. Henry thought that Etta may have been sued. A letter that Etta wrote to her friends would support this theory. From the research I did, I couldn't find anything about what the letter said. On December 2nd, Etta's attorney received a telegram that was signed by Etta. The letter would give directions to stop the paternity test against Henry. Police would look deeper into the telegram, and it turns out that it was ordered by a payphone in New York City, and to this day, the identity of this person remains unknown. Police would go to Worcester's Union Station where Henry supposedly dropped off Etta at. It turns out the day of Etta's disappearance, the train dispatcher received 3 phone calls between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. from an unlisted number. 2 of the calls were from the same man, and the 3rd call was from a woman. 2 people were saying that they wanted the staff to prevent Etta from getting on the train, and they wanted them to find her. On the 3rd call, the woman calling said that she was the Oxford switchboard operator. However, it turns out the woman was lying because that night the switchboard operator that was on duty was male. To this day, the 2 people who made these calls remain unknown. A full search was done on the station, and Etta was nowhere to be seen. In 1935, the police started diving deeper into this case. They questioned more people about the case and connections to the case. One person that police interviewed was a man whose identity is unknown. He was from Putnam, Connecticut, and seemed close to Etta. He seemed even more suspicious because at the time of Etta's disappearance, he went to Florida with someone whose identity also remains unknown. However, he was ruled out. In August of that year, a woman said she had shared an apartment with Etta in Boston. However, the same woman was eventually moved to a psychiatric hospital, which means she was probably lying. There were many other incidents of people coming forward with information, however, they all didn't lead anywhere. In the years after the disappearance, police suspected that Etta was secretly buried at Oxford Cemetery. Graves were searched between 1935 and 1937, but her remains were never discovered. This case became famous across the US. The case was included in a New York City program called the War Radio Mystery Stories program. 56 years later, Etta's case was brought back to light when Alma, Etta's daughter, filed a paternity test against Henry. She said that she wanted Henry to be labeled as her legal father. However, in 1993, her case was dismissed. Unfortunately, Alma passed away in 2006, not knowing what happened to her mother. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Glenn Miller was born in Iowa on March 1st, 1904. He spent the later part of his childhood in Fort Morgan in Colorado. In high school, he played football and trombone, which he had a talent for. After graduating, he would attend the University of Colorado. However, he would eventually drop out to pursue a career in music. Luckily, his career in music would be successful. He had a hit called In the Mood that was released in 1939. During World War II, Glenn was traveling across Europe performing concerts for the soldiers. On December 15th, 1944, Glenn was finished performing for soldiers in England. He was going to board a plane to France with his orchestra. Glenn and 2 crew members would board an aircraft called the UC-64A Norseman on the same day. On December 18th, Glenn was nowhere to be seen and hadn't met up with his orchestra for rehearsals. However, the members of the orchestra weren't concerned. They thought that the weather conditions or the war delayed their arrival. On December 27th, Glenn had still not shown up and was reported missing. The investigation revealed that the plane never made it to France. Without any evidence in France, the investigation would move to England where Glenn was last seen. The police found out that 2 of the other crew members that Glenn traveled with were John Morgan and Norman F. Bassell. The day they left, the path that they were taking showed that there was heavy fog. It turns out that John wasn't even certified to fly, so it was concluded that John was having trouble seeing and the plane crashed into the English Channel. There have been many theories, even going as far as Glenn might have faked his death. However, to this day, the remains of the plane have not been found, and also Glenn hasn't been found. However, if you Google Glenn Miller, it says he passed away on December 15th, 1944. Lawrence Joseph Bader was born on December 2nd, 1926 in Akron, Ohio. His father was a dentist, and Joseph was inspired by his father and also wanted to become a dentist. However, instead, Joseph would join the Navy in 1944. After serving for 2 years, he would enroll in the University of Akron. While he was only there for 1 semester, he did meet his future wife, Mary Lou Knapp. They got married on April 19th, 1952. 5 years after the couple married, they already had 3 children and were expecting a 4th. On May 15th, 1957, Joseph was going on a business trip to Cleveland, Ohio. He told his wife that afterwards he was going to go on a fishing trip. Mary would ask if he was going to come straight home after the fishing trip, to which he would reply by saying, "Maybe I will and maybe I won't." After driving to Cleveland, he would pay off some bills and would cash in a $400 check. After this, he would travel to Ohio's Rocky River, which is off from Lake Erie. However, that day that Joseph was going fishing, he was told 2 times that a storm was coming. The first time was by the owner of a boathouse, who was Lawrence Coltalor, and the second time was a Coast Guard who saw him on the water. According to Lawrence, when Joseph was renting the boat, he had a suitcase with him. Joseph was renting a boat that came with lights. However, it wouldn't have been dark for a while at that time. Joseph would take the boat on the water, and the Coast Guard who saw him would be the last person to see Joseph. The storm would occur that day, and the next morning Joseph's boat was found 5 miles away. Joseph was nowhere to be seen, as along with his suitcase. However, the boat seemed fine with only a bent propeller and a scratch. The life jacket was on the boat still, and some reports state that the gas was empty or the gas line was completely disconnected. A search for Joseph was conducted for 2 months. However, he was declared dead in 1960. However, something strange would happen on either May 18th or May 20th of 1957. A guy who is described as being charming would walk into a bar in Omaha, Nebraska to request a job. He had a suitcase with him and a Navy-issued driver's license. He said that his name was John Fritz Johnson. John would say that he served for 14 years but was released after having a bad back. A lot of people took a liking to John, and he got a job as a bartender and became a local celebrity. He was very outgoing and had a passion for archery. He would also get married to Nancy Zimmer, who was a former model, which led to John adopting her daughter, and they would also have a child together. He would eventually do a fundraising event for charity. He would sit on a flagpole for 15 or 30 days to raise money for a virus called polio. He would eventually become a radio personality for the radio station called KBON. Eventually, on February 2nd, 1965, a 21-year-old named Suzanne Pica got a phone call telling her to come to a sporting goods show in Chicago. The caller was apparently an acquaintance to Lawrence, who was her uncle. She would eventually arrive at the show, which is where John was giving a demonstration about archery stuff. John was wearing an eye patch and had a mustache, but Suzanne would recognize him as her deceased uncle. After his presentation, Suzanne would go up to John and ask him, "Pardon me, but aren't you my uncle, Larry Bader, who disappeared 7 years ago?" John would laugh at the question, but she was convinced that he was Lawrence. Eventually, a finger comparison would be tested, and Lawrence and John were a match, which made John Fritz Johnson's real identity Lawrence Joseph Bader. According to John, he had no memory of his past of being Lawrence. This discovery led to John being held under 10 days of medical observation. The doctors couldn't find anything about him lying about this. However, there weren't any leads that doctors could find. On September 16th, 1966, John or Lawrence Joseph Bader would die of a tumor.
Why must I see shadows?
In January of 1966, a new Prime Minister would be elected for Australia. This new Prime Minister would replace the loyal and the country's longest-serving leader, John Warhurst. His name was Harold Holt, and while not being in office for a while, he made changes, like changing the money currency to dollars and cents. On December 17th, 1967, it was a nice day to go swimming. Before lunch, Holt was going to the beach near his holiday home at Portsea on the Victorian coast. Holt did enjoy swimming, however, he wasn't the strongest swimmer. He also wasn't in the best health after just having shoulder surgery. The doctor said not to do some crazy shit like swimming, which is what he was going to do. He also played tennis recently after the surgery, which is stupid. The day when Holt went missing, the tide was high, and some people even said it was the highest they had seen it. Despite this, Holt swam further into the water, which is stupid. Before Holt went into the water, he told the group that he was with that, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." However, after going into the water, he was never seen again. He was reported missing, and the country of Australia was shocked about their Prime Minister being missing. The search was massive. There were about 300 people looking for Holt, but eventually, on January 5th, 1968, the search was called off. The only thing left behind him on that beach was just a pile of his clothes. Most people think that he had just drowned, and his body will most likely never be found. To this day, this case remains unsolved. Previously on the last video, we ended on the missing case of Harold Holt. Well, 2 years after his disappearance in the United States, a serial killer was running loose. The infamous identity of this serial killer is Charles Manson. However, before we talk about the horrific crimes of this serial killer, we need to go back to when he first started committing these horrible crimes. In 1967, after being released from prison, Charles Manson would move to San Francisco, California. As he stayed there, he would form a small group of loyal people called the Family. However, this group would grow to around 100 people. The group was essentially a religious cult, and Manson would teach about his religious beliefs. His beliefs were from science fiction and psychology. He would say that there would be a war about the human race, and he said that this would hurt the United States and leave him and his group in power. A few years before Manson moved to San Francisco, he would become really interested in the famous band known as the Beatles. In 1968, the Beatles would release their album called The White Album. Manson would be most interested in their song called Helter Skelter on the album. Manson would say that this song is about the Beatles predicting the human race war he was talking about. Manson would estimate that the war would happen in the summer of 1969. However, the war he talked about didn't happen. Eventually, Manson and his group would go on a killing spree. It is believed that Manson and his group killed 35 people. The group would go and kill celebrities in Hollywood. One of their first and more known victims was Sharon Tate. Sharon lived in a more isolated part of Beverly Hills, but there were still some neighbors. She was also pregnant at the time. On August 9th, 1969, Sharon was spending time with her friends at her home. Late into the night, neighbors reported to hear gunshots at Sharon's home. At 8 a.m. the next morning, the housekeeper discovered the bodies. Sharon was stabbed 16 times, and her unborn child didn't survive. Manson and his group would also be responsible for the murder of Lena LaBaca and Jay Sebring. Manson and his group would go on a murdering spree between August 8th to August 10th of 1969. In October of that year, Manson and his followers were caught on the suspicion of auto theft. They were charged with 9 murders, but like I said, it is believed to be way more. In 1971, Manson and 4 other of his members were sentenced to death. However, the trial was held in California, and in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, so their sentences were changed to life in prison the next year. Eventually, on November 19, 2017, Charles Manson would die of natural causes at the age of 83. There's a lot to Charles Manson and his cult, and I could probably make an entire video on it, so let me know if you would all want to see that. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945 in Long Beach, California to parents Harold and Opal Kraft. His father worked as a production operative, and his mother worked several jobs to help support the family. Randy had 3 older sisters who he was very close with, and he was also close with his mother. In school, Randy was known for being very intelligent. When he was a junior in high school, he was placed into accelerated learning classes, and he was a very pleasant person to be around. While growing up, Randy would date girls, but he would soon realize that he was more attracted to men and kept the secret. However, once he enrolled at Claremont College, he would get his first job working as a bartender at a gay bar. Randy would hook up with men at the bar multiple times. Once he got into college, his grades would also start to slip, and he would start drinking and doing drugs. His grades got so bad that he had to repeat classes, which would prevent him from graduating. In 1966, he was arrested after trying to hook up with an undercover cop at Hunting Beach. He wasn't charged from this, so his record remained clean. In 1967, he would eventually graduate with a degree in economics. Shortly after graduating in 1968, he would join the U.S. Air Force. He would do well in the Air Force by ranking up to Airman First Class, and he would also become a supervisor. However, he told high military officials about his sexuality, and he was given a medical discharge. After this, he would tell his family about his sexuality. His parents didn't support his lifestyle at first, but they would eventually accept it. After telling his family, though, he also became distant, just like his father. In 1970, Randy would commit his second crime. Randy would approach a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Francher. Joseph was a runaway, and Randy would tell him that he could stay at his apartment. Randy would also say that he could have sex with a woman he knew. Once Joseph came to Randy's apartment, he was given drugs, and he was sexually assaulted. Luckily, Joseph was able to escape after Randy left for work. He was taken to the hospital, and police would come to question him. Joseph was embarrassed about the sexual assault, and he didn't tell police about it. He also said that the drugs he was given, he agreed to take. Unfortunately, after an only small investigation, Randy was not charged. In 1971, Randy would start his murdering spree. Randy would commit his murders in Southern California. Specifically, he would commit murders in Orange County. Most of his victims were young men from ages 13 to 35, and they were mostly hitchhikers. Randy would offer alcohol in his car, and these victims would go with him. Once they got into the car, Randy would drug them with tranquilizers. After this, he would bind the victims so they can't move, and he would proceed to rape them. After he would kill them from either strangulation, bludgeoning, or asphyxiation, he he would dump the bodies near freeways. This would give Randy the nickname the Freeway Killer. By 1975, Randy had 14 victims, and police had no leads on the serial killer. However, the friends of one of Randy's victims recognized Randy's black and white Mustang. Police would go to question Randy, and after questioning him, they thought he was the serial killer. However, the victim was believed to be killed by accident, and no charges were filed. But finally, on May 14th, 1983, Randy was arrested after driving under the influence. Police would investigate his car, and they discovered the body of one of his victims, Terry Lee Gambrell. This time, the police finally decided to not be stupid, and they actually launched an entire investigation of Randy. They found bloodstains and drugs in his car. Randy was charged with Terry's murder, and they would connect his other murders together. In September 1988, Randy's trial would start and last for 13 months. Randy was charged with 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation. Randy was given the death penalty. However, Randy is still on death row to this day. He's currently 78 years old, so he will most likely die of natural causes or something. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, was born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. However, he and his family moved to Wichita, Kansas, which is where he was raised. His father, William E. Rader, was in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II, and after he would go to work at the Kansas Electric Utility. His mother, Dorothea M. Rader, worked as a bookkeeper at Leaker's IGA Market in Park City, Kansas. Dennis seemed normal from the outside. He joined the Boy Scouts, and he would also participate in group activities that his church would do. However, secretly, when Dennis was growing up, he would cut out females in magazines, and he would draw ropes and gags on the cutouts, so he wasn't the most normal when he was growing up. After he would finish drawing these pictures, he would glue them onto an index card like they were Pokemon cards, and he would carry them around. He would also get excited in a sexual way when he would read books about murder. He wanted to tie women to train tracks, and he would also tie cats to trees and hang them until they would die. A psychologist named Dr. Terrence G. Leary studied Rader and said that his behavior in his childhood was most likely caused by abuse. Leary believes that in reality his childhood wasn't so stable. Dennis would go to Riverview Elementary School and he would struggle with school. He was a below average student and was more described as being very introverted. He would eventually graduate in 1963 at Wichita Heights High School, and after he would get a job working at a small grocery store. In 1966, when he was 21, he would join the U.S. Air Force. Even while being in the Air Force, it wouldn't stop him from being weird because he'd peek through windows and watch women undress, and he would steal women's underwear. Soon after he returned from the Army, he would get married on May 22, 1971 to Paula Diaz. In July 1973, he would get a job at a small aircraft manufacturing company called Cessna, but soon after he would go to college at Wichita State University to get a bachelor's degree so he could become a police officer. However, in late 1973, he would get fired from Cessna. He became really unhappy because of getting fired, and it led him to thinking about the dark thoughts that he had had when he was a child. He would eventually start something called trolling. Now, it's not that type of trolling where you film a dead body in the forest, but he would drive around neighborhoods and school campuses and look at young women to lust over. He would stalk women in grocery stores, and he went to hide in the back of their car and kidnap them once they got in. By 1974, he was ready to go after his first victims. In the neighborhood that Dennis lived in, a new Latino family moved in called the Oteros. Joseph Otero, who was 38, and his wife Julie Otero, who was 33, had 5 children. Dennis became attracted to Julie and her 11-year-old daughter Josephine because they were Latino. He would stalk the family to get to know their routine, and on January 15, 1974, he would commit his first murders. He grabbed what he called his hit kit, which was knives, a gun, cords, tape, plastic bags, hoods, and gloves. At 7 to 7:30 a.m., he went into the family's backyard and cut their phone line. Dennis would enter the house when one of the children was likely letting the family dog out and the door was open. He was thinking that there was only Julie, Josephine, and their 9-year-old son Joey in the house, but he would discover that Joseph was also in the house. The couple's 3 older children were at school at the time. Dennis broke into the home. After realizing this, he would threaten the family with his gun and then tell them he needed money, food, and a car to flee the home. He would say that he wouldn't hurt them and he tied them up. However, soon after, Dennis would put a bag over Joseph's head and some cord and he would strangle him to death. He would do the same thing to the rest of the family. While Dennis was putting the bag over Joey's head, Julie woke up, so Dennis would make his way back over to Julie and kill her by strangling her with a cord. Joey would eventually die from suffocation. Eventually, Josephine woke up and Dennis would take her to the basement and he would hang her on a pipe, which is when she would pass away. Unfortunately, the person who discovered the bodies was just one of their older siblings, Charlie, who was just 15 years old at the time. Once he got home from school, he would discover the bodies and try to call police, but the phone lines were cut. He would go get help from a neighbor and they would call the police. Police would arrive and search the house and they would find the disturbing scene. To make this even worse, it was reported that Dennis masturbated on some of his victims. Joseph's watch was missing and Julie's purse was dumped out, but besides that, there wasn't anything else that was stolen. Unfortunately, at the time, police were unable to find the killer. To make Dennis's crimes even worse, he would photograph his victims after he killed them. On April 4th, 1974, Dennis would kill Catherine Bray after she returned home with her brother Kevin, which Dennis was not expecting. Like he said to the Otero family, he needed money, food, and a car to escape town. He brought the two into the bedroom and forced Kevin to tie his sister's hands and feet. Dennis would try to tie up Kevin too, but Kevin fought back and was able to escape Dennis. Unfortunately, while the struggle was happening, Kevin wasn't able to get the gun, and Dennis got a hold of it and shot him in the head twice. Dennis would then go back to the other room to finish killing Catherine, but she would also fight back, but she was unfortunately overpowered by Dennis. Dennis realized that trying to strangle her wasn't going to work, so he stabbed her in the abdomen multiple times. While Dennis was with Catherine, Kevin was able to escape the house and get into his car to go get help. Unfortunately, by the time that paramedics got to the home, Catherine Bright was dead. Fortunately, Kevin was able to survive the attack and recover fully. It would be 3 years after this murder that Dennis would kill again. Dennis was driving through neighborhoods when he spotted Shirley Vian. Dennis was planning on going to kill another woman named Cheryl, but she was not home that day. Dennis would go down Hydraulic Street and saw a 5-year-old boy named Steve Rawford. Dennis pulled out a picture of his wife and son and asked if they knew who they were. Steve would say no, and he would return home. It turns out that Steve was the son of Shirley, and it was most likely to test if he would know who he was when he would return to their house. Later, Dennis would return to the house of his next victim, posing as a detective. Steve would answer the door and let him in, since to him he was a detective. There are 3 other people in the house at the time, which were Steve's 2 other siblings and his mom, Shirley Vian. He turned off the TV and shut the blinds. Shirley would come out into the living room and was immediately scared of the stranger in her home. Dennis would lock all 3 of the children in the bathroom. He told Shirley that he wanted to do stuff to her, but told her it wasn't going to be rape. He would calm her down with a glass of water and a cigarette. However, after this, he would strangle Shirley to death with a cord. Dennis would leave when the phone in the house started to ring, which led the 3 children screaming for their mom. After her death, her husband Richard Vian would raise the children. In December 1977, Dennis would obsessively stalk 25-year-old Nancy Fox. On December 8th, Dennis would cut the phone lines and wait for Nancy to get home. When she got home, Dennis would attack her. Just like his other victims, he tied her up and said he had a sexual issue and was going to rape her. After he finished, he would strangle her to death. The following day, he would make a call to police saying, "Yes, we'll find a homicide at 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox." That's correct. Police would find Nancy's body, and they would replay the police call recording to try to find the identity of this person through their voice, but they couldn't find anything. He had 3 more victims, which were 53-year-old Maureen Hedge in 1985, 28-year-old Vicky Wedgler in September 1986, and his final victim, 62-year-old Dorless Davis. By the time he killed Davis, he thought he was getting too old to kill since he was in his mid-40s. Dennis would hide from the public eye until 2004. It was the 30-year anniversary of the Otero family murder, and the Wichita Eagle newspaper ran an article about it. Also, author Robert Beatty would release a book called Nightmare in Wichita: The Hunt for the BTK Strangler. Both the article and book made Dennis think they were trying to make profit from his murders. On March 17, 2004, Dennis would send a letter to the Wichita Eagle under the fake identity of Bill Thomas Kilman, which the initials read BTK. Bind, torture, and kill. The letter contained pictures of Vicky Wedgler and her driver's license. The letter was also signed with the same signature that he had signed with previous letters. This letter sent Dennis back into the public eye. Dennis would send the letter, and then the letter would be a word puzzle like he was the Riddler from Batman. On June 9th, 2004, he left a package taped to a stop sign. It included a gruesome description of the Otero murders and a sketch of a body hanging called "The Sexual Thrill Is My Bill." On June 17, 2004, another package was found in the Wichita, Kansas Public Library, which he would say that he was about to pass away and he wanted to kill again. On October 22, 2004, another package was found containing a drawing of children with bindings across their bodies and faces. He would also try to mislead police with false information about BTK. He would say that he was born in Wichita, but in reality he wasn't. Dennis would eventually get the position as the president of his church. 8 days after getting this position, he would say that there was a box with a bomb in the back of a pickup truck. Inside the box there was an information about the killings he had done, and there was also a question from Dennis about a floppy disk. Dennis would ask if a floppy disk could be traced, and police would say that it couldn't be traced, which they lied about. On January 25, 2005, a box was found at the Cake TV studio, which contained a doll with a noose around its neck, dead to a pipe, which was the recreation of Josephine Otero's murder. On February 3rd, 2005, Dennis would send a letter to Cake TV saying that he was going to send a floppy disk. On February 16th, 2005, a floppy disk was found and it was traced back to a computer that was used at the church under the name Dennis. They found out that the church's president, Dennis Rader, sent the disk. They would ask Dennis's daughter for a DNA sample to match the semen found at the crime scene. The DNA was a match to the semen, and after 30 years, Dennis Rader was identified as the BTK killer. On February 25th, 2005, police surrounded Dennis's car and he was arrested. Dennis wouldn't talk at first, but eventually he would give a 30-hour confession. Police would find evidence connecting him to his other murders. Dennis was sentenced to life in prison under 10 counts of first-degree murder, and is up for parole in 2180, which, if he somehow lives to 235, I think he might be dying in prison. Dennis is currently in prison at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas. Gary Ray Bowles, also known as the I-95 Killer, would be convicted of killing 6 gay men from March to October of 1994. Gary would travel to different states by the southern and eastern seaboard. He would go and pretend to be interested in these men and stay at their house for a week. Once he gained these men's trust, he would kill them. After he would kill them, he would stuff toilet paper, rags, dirt, leaves, and sometimes adult toys in his victims' mouths. After killing his victims, he would take their credit card and their car to go kill his next victim. Gary would go on a killing spree, and after killing 6 gay men, he got caught. He would be caught after he killed his last victim, which was 47-year-old Walter Jamel Hinton in Jacksonville Beach. Gary would say that he killed 7 people, but the police wouldn't investigate his 7th victim. Gary was given the death penalty, and he was given lethal injection on August 22nd, 2019 at Florida State Prison. His last words would be a handwritten apology to the Hilton family by saying he was so very sorry to all of the family and friends of Mr. Hinton, and he would also say, "I never wanted to kill him, and I'm sorry for all the pain and suffering I've caused." Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959 in Cleveland, Ohio. Anthony was subjected to abuse when he was a child. At just 11 years old, he began to rape his 11-year-old niece. When he was 18 years old, he would enlist into the U.S. Marine Corps, and he would serve for 7 years before being discharged in 1985. Once he returned home, he would start committing crimes, like giving a minor drugs and alcohol, and his crimes would become even worse when he was charged with domestic violence. However, in 1989, Anthony would rape a 21-year-old woman. Luckily, she was able to survive the incident, and Anthony was given 15 years in prison. However, after he got out in 2005, he would begin his killings. His first victim was 38-year-old Crystal Dozier, and she had 7 children. She had been struggling with drug addiction after she lost one of her children. Anthony would lure Crystal with the promise of giving her drugs at his home, but once Crystal got to his home, Anthony raped and killed her. He would go on a killing spree for 2 years, and he would target women that he thought their loved ones wouldn't report them missing. Anthony would be correct because some of his victims weren't even known to be missing until their remains were found. However, Crystal was one of the victims that was reported missing. Police would say that since Crystal was using drugs, they figured that she would be back in a few days. Unfortunately, the police didn't care to look into this at all, which could have saved many victims. It wouldn't be until 2009 that Anthony's killings would end. In September of that year, Anthony was planning on targeting a woman who wanted to get drugs from him. However, similar to all of his other killings, he beat her, raped, and choked her with an electrical cord until she passed out. Luckily, she wasn't dead, and Anthony let her leave. Anthony would threaten her if she went to police about him. She would listen and not go to police right away. So a month later, on October 20th, Anthony promised another woman alcohol and drugs. Once she arrived, she realized she forgot her ID, but Anthony would lunge and attack her. Luckily, she was able to escape by climbing out a 3rd-story window. She was naked, and Anthony's neighbors saw and called the police. However, once police arrived, she refused to speak to them, and Anthony had fled the scene. It turns out, though, that woman eventually went to the police and filed a report. Her attack and the other woman's report allowed police to get a search warrant for Anthony's home. Police would find 2 decomposing bodies and a shallow grave in Anthony's basement. They would find 8 more bodies in total, and a woman's skull wrapped in a paper bag. It was revealed that Anthony had 11 victims in total. Luckily, on Halloween 2009, Anthony would be found and arrested. It turns out that Anthony had spent $20,000 to get new plumbing, grease traps, and sewer lines to hide the smell of the bodies. Anthony's trial was very publicized, and eventually Anthony would be charged on 81 charges, including kidnapping, rape, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and 11 counts of murder. He was given the death penalty, but would die in February 2021 from natural causes. Anthony's house was demolished, and in replacement, a memorial site called the Garden of 11 Angels is there to remember his victims. Richard Beasley was a serial killer who looked for his victims on the website known as Craigslist. Richard would offer men looking for work $300 a week and housing in a 2-bedroom trailer. His offer would read, "Wanted, caretaker for farm. Simply watch over 688-acre patch of hilly farmland and feed a few cows." More than 100 men responded in desperate need of work. One of these men was 48-year-old Scott Davis. Richard would agree to meet up on November 6, 2011. Richard would also have an accomplice who was 16-year-old Brogan Rafferty. When they met up, Richard gave a fake name, which is Jack, and his accomplice's fake name was Rafferty, and he said that that was his nephew. After they met up at the restaurant, they would leave to go to a wooded area, which is where the farm was. Once they got out, Scott was standing, and he heard what sounded like a gun misfiring. Scott was unfortunately shot in the elbow, but he started running. While he ran, his baseball cap that he had on fell off. He eventually made it to a home, which is where he called police. He would lead police to find his hat, so they could use it as evidence. When they arrived at the location, they found an empty grave, which was meant for Scott. As they investigated, it turned out there was 2 other bodies, which were Ralph Ginger, and the identity of the other body was unknown until 5 days after their investigation started. They got a call from a woman named Deborah Bruce, who said that her brother, David Pauly, had replied to an ad similar to the one that Richard put up. She was able to confirm it was David because of the ID bracelet he was wearing when he died. Police would investigate the Craigslist ad posted and trace them to a home in Akron, Ohio, which is where Richard rented a floor of the home using Ralph's identity. Luckily, Richard and his accomplice were arrested on November 16, 2011. During their trial, they were also found being connected to the murder of Timothy Kern. Richard's accomplice was given life in prison on 3 counts of murder, and Richard was given the death penalty. However, Richard's trial was done again in 2020 after a procedural error was found in the 2013 trial, but he was still given the death penalty. Richard is still on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio. So I didn't include this in the original video. I don't have a script for this, by the way, so I'm probably gonna have to cut a bunch of stuff out. But my grandparents were most likely the next victims of BTK. So BTK went onto my grandpa and grandma's property, and my grandpa was most likely outside, or maybe he saw him from inside. And he was most likely trying to like get into the house by disguising himself as an electrician, which I think he was trying to do. I bet his next victims were my grandparents, which is kind of terrifying to think about, and it's also weird to think about. From all the research I've done, he stalked his victims, which could mean that he could have stalked my grandparents or grandma or whoever, which is weird to think about and kind of creepy. Luckily, my grandpa was there, and he told him to get off his property, and he listened and never came back. But it is kind of terrifying to think about that my grandparents were almost the next victims of BTK. But I thought it was a cool story to share, how my grandpa basically, told a serial killer to get off his property. I think that's a pretty cool story. But yeah, thank you all for watching. I just want to make one massive videos of these 2 videos, and I do really appreciate the support you have shown on these 2 videos. I very much appreciate it. And yeah, thank you all for watching. I have the next video planned. And yeah, I'll see you all later. Have a good one, and goodbye.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me.